We're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm Eileen Galuli, and I'm the Associate Director of the Society of Fellows in the Humanities and the Heyman Center. And it's my privilege to introduce Max Hayward, who's our inaugural Public Humanities Fellow at the Heyman Center for the Humanities. And what he's going to present today is the project he's been working on as a fellow. He's finishing up his first year, which is about the conception and implementation of something called Rethink, which is a philosophy community outreach program, which he'll tell you all about. And I just wanted to say a word about what the Public Humanities Fellowship is. It was developed last year with, that's right, last year? Leah Namias, who's from the New York Council for the Humanities. The fellowships were established, developed alongside them. And it includes, it's a consortium of humanities centers located at Columbia, Cornell, CUNY, NYU, Syracuse, and we're adding this year the State University, also Buffalo, and this year the State University at Stony Brook. And the idea is to bring humanities scholarship into the public realm, to encourage humanities graduate students to conceive of their work in relation to the public sphere, and to explore public dimensions of their own scholarship in partnership with community organizations like the Harlem
Justice Community
Project, which serves public audiences throughout New York State. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Max.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming to be here, and thank you to the Heyman Center for providing a bribe in the form of lunch.
We didn't advertise the lunch, though.
Well, for all those who didn't know about lunch, a special thanks to you, because you didn't know that there was going to be a perk for attending. So just before I start on the substance of my talk, I have some words of thanks. So now I'm coming to the end of my tenure as Public Humanities Fellow. I really want to thank everyone at the Heyman Center and at the New York Council for the Humanities, and in particular for their guidance and support, Eileen and Leah Namias, who's from the New York Council, and they were primarily responsible for overseeing what I did this year. I also, although none of them were able to be here today, I'd like to thank the fellow members of my cohort from the other universities. We had many fruitful interactions, sharing some of our experiences and different advice that we were able to gather from the challenges in developing and implementing a public humanities program in New York. And also to congratulate them. Dave, if you're interested in some of the other projects that have been implemented this year, speak to Leah, because some very impressive things have been done. And I'd also like to thank all the people who participated in the Public Humanities project that I've been working on. Robbie Kubala, first and foremost, who really could have taken this fellowship instead of me. John Pantuzzo, Adam Blazai, Alex Regas, Yoni Pasternak, Kieran Jimenez, Sandra Lindgren, and Jordan Brensinger. So, as you probably know, the New York Council for the Humanities, or NICH, is the body that's primarily responsible for coordinating and sponsoring public humanities programs in New York State. That's to say, if anyone knows about the current state of public humanities programming, it's Leah and the other people at NICH. So it was a real surprise to me when Leah told me that philosophy projects are rare in public humanities programming. I think this is sad, because I think this indicates a missed opportunity. So what I want to talk about, I want to explain the workings of the Public Humanities Project that I've been involved with. And one of my aims is to show just how well-placed philosophy is to reach out to a non-academic audience. And I also want to explain what I think philosophy has to offer as a public humanities program, has to offer to potential participants outside of academia. And finally, I want to say just a few words about what I think we as philosophers stand to gain and why I think we really ought to care about public outreach work. Not just because of the benefit that I think it offers to people who are outside of the academy and who are not professional philosophers, but also because of what I think it could offer to the pursuit of philosophy itself. My project's called Rethink. It was started by Robbie Kubala, who's here at Columbia Philosophy Department, and John Pantuzzo, who's at Teachers College, and myself. Robbie and I both have interests in moral philosophy, and we were very distressed and somewhat frustrated by the thought that the work that we were doing as graduate students really seemed to be ultimately just for ourselves, and maybe perhaps our immediate peers that we were, who are direct interlocutors, people that we were talking to, helping with their own work, helping them to develop their positions. But neither of us doubt that philosophy, and including moral philosophy, has an important role to play in society in general. But the examples that spring to mind of what influence philosophy has in society seem rather indirect, and we were worried that some of the more immediate benefits that philosophy has for us were things that were really reserved for a very small class of people. People who are pursuing work, graduate work in philosophy, and maybe those that we teach, but we're teaching at something very much an elite university, reaching out to a comparatively small group of people. Columbia has been known for some time for the long-running and highly successful outreach program that teaches philosophy in high schools. And it was an outreach program meeting that we met John Pantuzzo from Teachers College. Although the existing outreach program has been very successful, we envisaged working with a different population who we thought that might benefit even more, perhaps, from the opportunity, the not currently existing opportunity to pursue and think about philosophy, even more than the high school students who are currently working with the current outreach program, and these are people who are already sufficiently motivated to join an after-school philosophy club. So we had in mind a different audience, people who we really thought of as without a voice, and maybe the most disadvantaged people in our society today, the incarcerated and the court-involved. Both Robbie and John have a history teaching inside prisons, but we soon realized that it was actually a better option than going into prisons if we wanted to reach this demographic that we had in mind. First off, there were practical reasons. There's a lot of security clearance needed to get volunteers into prison, and we thought that having such a high barrier would deter potential volunteers, and we really wanted to set up something that would be self-sustaining and wouldn't require this extra level of motivation over and above the interest in doing philosophy outreach. Likewise, just going into prisons is a significant journey from here, which is just another big commitment if we were thinking of having something that would happen every week. But more importantly, John's experience showed that working within prisons was not necessarily conducive to the spirit of open-mindedness that we take to be a precondition for doing good philosophical work. Because you see, when you're working within prisons, you often have prison guards sitting in on the meetings, and sometimes, perhaps often, they resent the fact that inmates are receiving free education, free college-level education, people who are teaching at expensive private schools, as we are, and being treated also, in the course of doing a philosophy discussion, they're being treated in a manner that's very different from their role, the normal role they occupy in the prison environment. And frequently, John told me, guards would interject into discussions to ridicule or humiliate participants who said something that they didn't agree with, or just who said anything. One of the goals that we had, as I'll explain, was to offer people an opportunity to express and consider and justify their evaluative perspectives. And perhaps this was an opportunity that they'd never really had, and we knew that the experiment wouldn't work if they were trying to do this in the face of the possibility of ridicule. But it's not necessary to actually work in a prison to work with the disadvantaged people we wanted to reach. And there's a recidivism or reoffending rates, as you probably know, in New York are incredibly, and elsewhere in this country, are incredibly high. So working with people who are on parole or probation often is working with people with the same group of people. And very often, both amongst people who work with the court involved And amongst the good involved themselves, there's just an expectation that once you've gone in, you're going to get back. So it seemed that working with people who had just got out was an excellent moment. And another reason is that these people often, at the point where they're very motivated, looking to make up for educational opportunities that they've missed or lost altogether, and trying to break the cycle of reincarceration. And many of these people are right here in Harlem. So who do we work with? So Rethink works with, the term that we use is court-involved youth, who are mainly from Harlem and the South Bronx, although we've had some participants from Manhattan Valley, just south of here, and a few have actually come from as far away as Brooklyn. So court-involved is the term most used in this kind of work. It's used to refer to people who are formerly incarcerated or who are on probation. But it's one of our principles that we never ever ask our participants directly why they're there. Sometimes they volunteer this, they'll tell us, but it's always something that they have the opportunity to leave at the door. So we never know exactly what everyone's reason for being in that group is. Our participants are about 17 to 24 years old and overwhelmingly Black or Latino. And for the philosophers, it's an inclusive disjunction. Although we've had some female students and some students from other ethnic groups. We don't recruit directly for our meetings, but rather we partner with community organizations here in Harlem whose remit is to work with this demographic of court-involved youth. Two of our partner organizations, so the Harlem Justice Community Program that Eileen mentioned and the Fortune Society, the participants we work with are called Justice Scholars. They receive stipends to spend 6 months to a year with the organizations, participating in educational activities to improve their literacy, gain their GEDs, apply to college, prepare CVs. Harlem Justice, they also get involved with volunteering in the community as part of the activities that they enroll in as Justice Scholars. And my group at Fortune Society have also revealed that they are very keen at performing traditional South Indian dances, because one of the social workers and instructors that is with that group is herself of South Indian origin and has organised an event where they will perform traditional South Indian dance. So now Rethink is part of the programme that they all take voluntarily as Justice Scholars. So we have a third community partnership called the Mission Society, working with a slightly different group. Our participants are called Credible Messengers. They are older ex-gang members who go out onto the streets to disrupt and prevent violent crime. And I don't know if anyone's heard of this program, but they've had an enormous effect on reducing gun violence in central Harlem. And in fact, since the program started, central Harlem had its longest spell without gun violence for a really, really long time. The leader of this group goes, when he's at the Mission Society, he's known by the name Beloved, but apparently his street moniker is Bad News. The Mission's a new partnership, and although we've actually had success, and we're actually quite surprised how much success in applying our model to this somewhat different context, we're still developing and fine-tuning a more tailored approach for that group. So today I'm going to focus on the work we do with the two other much more established partnership locations. So what do we do? A group of graduate students from Columbia and teachers between 2 and 4 head out to each partner location once a week to hold 1-hour sessions. The reason to have multiple volunteers isn't just because of the inherently challenging nature of working with this demographic we serve. Rather, many of our participants have been failed by the traditional classroom setup with the straightforward teacher-student dynamic, and they often feel uncomfortable or even hostile towards that kind of environment, and really for reasons that I don't think are, there are systematic reasons why this has happened. But we want to be able to present the material in a way that this initial discomfort shouldn't get in the way of our being able to start talking about philosophy. So as much as possible, we arranged to sit around in a circle with the participants, with the volunteers in different places, and when, as happens, someone needs to write something on the board, we always make a point that one person may stand up to go to the board, but the other person should sit down and stay with the participants, so there's not this sense of the authority figures who are telling them what to think and them. So discussions are themed around a main topic of philosophical interest, power or redistributive justice or paternalism, responsibility, testimony, punishment, self-interest, and so on. I suppose, as you can see from that list, there's a bias towards moral and political philosophy, but we also talk about other issues, especially epistemological. But this isn't how we introduce the topics. We don't say, today we're going to sit down and learn about epistemology. Rather, we try to start off discussion by talking about cases and stories that are from people's everyday lives. So we'll ask a question. When we're talking about paternalism, we ask people in the group to tell us, what's a topic that you're really good at giving advice about? So we went around the room and people said, well, I'm good at giving advice about how to get onto a basketball team, or I'm good at giving advice about this, or I'm good at giving advice about that. And then we asked, can you think of a time when someone that you know didn't follow the advice that you gave them and would have been better off if you had? And of course, this was a way of introducing some of the ideas behind paternalism. When we talked about responsibility, we said, let's go into them and let's name one good thing that happened that we were responsible for. And then we would sort of ask questions to explain why they were responsible for that, how this distinguished from cases where they weren't responsible. And as we would go around, we'll start to try and develop suggestions or ideas coming from asking these questions that will go towards developing nascent theories, which we might write on a board, a kind of initial statement of what made me responsible in the cases where I was responsible. And that's something that we'll aim to modify as the discussion goes on. So after we've had this introductory moment when we're just trying to lead into a philosophical question from something that is accessible to everyone, we'll take discussions further by using one of a few different techniques. So sometimes we'll discuss a reading, either a heavily adapted pop philosophy text, or more commonly, we'll use an adapted, relevant newspaper article. So we use techniques on discussion facilitation that were taught to us by people at Niche, which are actually, it's a fantastic model, and we really all appreciated the training opportunities that we got there. So we use the text as a tool to spur healthy discussion. So the aim is not to focus on interpreting the text and just talking about what the text says, but rather we'll use the text to introduce controversial ideas without causing offence in the way that one might if you just said something that people might object to. So it could focus, say, disagreement on the text rather than on an individual. And another benefit of having a text in front of you is that when discussion gets a bit heated, you can use it as a way to redirect attention. But actually, far more often, we don't use any readings whatsoever. One thing we'll do is we'll present participants with vignette scenarios that are relevant to the topic at hand, asking them for their reasons and their responses, and for the reasons for their responses. So presenting people with pairs of cases and saying, in which case did someone have an obligation to others, and in which case did someone have an obligation to themselves, for example, and asking them to justify and give a reason for why they thought what they said. Often the way we did this is we had this model called justify and challenge. So one person gives a response, and then other people in the group get a chance to challenge it. And sometimes we'll split them up into different teams so that they can collaborate in developing responses and challenges, or sometimes they do it one by one. And then after they've had a challenge, they get another chance to give more justifications for their original position, or for explaining why they now want to accede to the challenge and change their minds. So this is a way of practicing this notion of giving reasons and justifications. Another thing we do is what we call model disagreement. So two volunteers will stage a debate about the topic for the day. Say, the consequentialist versus the retributivist justifications for punishment. So the two parties will stage the debate, and then the others get a chance to weigh in on one side or the other after the framework for the debate has been set up. Now, of course, we don't always end up with conclusions to any of these exercises, and that's not necessarily the goal, to have people coming away saying, I'm a consequentialist about punishment, and I don't believe in traditional views of responsibility, or but we do actually sometimes engage in consensus building exercises. So, for example, at the end of one group's tenure with us, we presented our participants with a list of potential principles which they could say that everyone ought to obey and endorse. And first we went around and they had a chance to amend them, to make them more plausible and to debate amendments that they could make, and to rule certain ones out. At the end, the goal was to vote on a much smaller list, which everyone could agree on once they'd been suitably amended. So what's distinctive about this then? And why does this need to be philosophy? Well, for a start, one thing you'll notice is how little of a role reading and writing is playing in this. That's not to say there's anything wrong with reading and writing. It's not against people developing literacy skills. But many of our participants are very hesitant readers who have reading levels that are much below those of that normally suited with that age group. And they get very embarrassed and frustrated when presented with texts. So the challenge of reading, unless we present it very carefully, can make the less confident members of the group hostile or uncommunicative, and this is obviously something we really want to avoid. Part of the educational mission of the courses offered by Fortune and Harlem Justice focuses on improving reading and writing skills, but the fact remains that the participants that we're working with are in general a long way away from reading any philosophy text that hasn't been heavily adapted, let alone reading any kind of advanced literature or history or other significant texts from other humanities. But they can still think about philosophy. The fact that their reading skills are not as good as they could be doesn't mean that they're not thoughtful and capable of engaged discursive thought. And not only that, by making philosophical issues take off from everyday cases, and indeed as presenting philosophical ways of thinking as a way of overcoming puzzles that arise about everyday life, or developing justifications that they can give for their opinions when they're challenged, we actually get them to really care about philosophy and the methods of philosophy. And by taking our participants' views seriously, something many of them do not experience often, and by removing the student-teacher dynamic, which is something you can do when there's not this body of facts that you need to impart, we made people engaged in totally new ways. One social worker told us that a participant who just joined the group, or at least who had never come to one of our meetings, he spent the entire session arguing his case on a particular topic. And the social worker told us that this participant had been with the program for some months, although he'd never come to one of our meetings, and had never spoken in any activity that they'd ever had. He'd sat there in silence the entire time until he came to one of our discussions. I've had a participant who turned up to class totally stoned, and eyes completely bloodshot, and he sat slumped in a corner, didn't say a word, and initially just grunted in response to questions. And then by the end of the class, he was producing a detailed reductio ad absurdum of another participant's attitude towards testimony and conspiracy theories. One of our participants asked if he could intern for us. I'm not sure what that would involve. I wish we could have done. Another, when we challenged him, the challenge for the group was to produce a general principle to cover distribution of contested resources. And he came up to me during the class and he said that he felt dizzy. He said, no, not physically dizzy. I'm dizzy in a different way. I've never felt this way before. But this is really making my mind feel different. And he left, at the end, he came up and said, You know, what Google searches can I do to find out more about justice and equality? And of course, you know, it's not all sunshine. This is a really, really hard demographic to work with. Casual misogyny and homophobia is rife. People tune out. People ask why should they care. Or the most challenging thing is that they'll often attack people who show too much eagerness. But frankly, I mean, anything less than that would be a miracle, I think. Of course, also, you know, we have to simplify questions as we introduce them. And in the end, our participants rarely end up with positions that are sufficiently well articulated to stand up in even a freshman class here at Columbia. But the fact is that we've had high school dropouts who've been abused by the police, abused by the prison system, frequently abused by their own families. Almost all of our participants have reported receiving physical beatings from parents or grandparents at some stage in their lives. These people in impassioned debates about justice or testimony or responsibility or the relation between moral and prudential obligations or on epistemic authority or equality and, of course, on the justification of punishment. So my point is twofold. The first is that this program, Rethink, works. It gets people, perhaps most unlikely people, interested in philosophy. But second, philosophy, perhaps uniquely amongst the humanities, is something that you can do in a situation that's far removed from the traditional academic context. You don't need readings. You don't need to recite the names of, you know, a list of dead white men. You don't need people to think of themselves as students. We start conversations about issues that people are familiar with, and they find themselves doing philosophy. And that's, after all, how philosophy was done at its birth. Indeed, I think the notion of philosophy is something that can only or is best done within academic confines is one that is historically quite particular, not just in the ancient world, but you know, even in the modern era, many of the greatest philosophers, like Hume and Mill, never held a university position and wrote for non-academic audiences. The difference here, of course, is who is participating. It's not just wealthy Athenians or the journal-reading classes of 18th and 19th century Britain. Of course, this invites a question. It's all well and good to say we can do philosophy as a public humanity, and I mean really public, really far from the academy. But why bother? I mean, what's philosophy actually got to offer our participants? I mean, people whose problems are as pressing as those we work with. Poverty and unemployment, racial profiling, poor literacy, lack of qualifications, violence, and this perpetual threat of reincarceration. I isn't talking about philosophy just a distraction from other, more worthwhile things they could be doing. I was once told philosophy is not for everyone, and maybe that's right. Well, I think there are two basic ways you could go about justifying the dissemination of philosophy. You could argue that knowledge, and especially philosophical knowledge, is just intrinsically valuable. People should do philosophy even if there were no other effect on their lives that they know more about philosophy. It's just interesting for its own sake. I don't want to argue against this view, but I don't really want to talk about it either, because it's the sort of justification that you're only going to accept if you're already bought into the value of philosophy. And you know, frankly, I think it's going to be a pretty hard sell to say that philosophy is so intrinsically valuable that everyone has to be doing it, even people who don't have basic literacy or skills or GEDs. So I think another way of justifying philosophy is start something like this. First off, there are some transferable skills, as they say, that philosophy is really great at imparting. So the key slogan, as I mentioned, that we always repeat, is that people need to give reasons for whatever they say. Now that's the thing that is at the heart of all philosophy, but it's not just a philosophical virtue. It's a big part of living in the world and succeeding in society. Being articulate in this sense is a huge advantage for everyone, and it's one that our participants often lack because of the way that the education system has failed them, amongst other reasons, and it's one they lack coming in. And someone who can explain why he does and thinks what he does and thinks is a better student or employee and an easier person to be around. So I think this is an advantage for our participants in their own lives. And a related thing that philosophy really trains you for is reasoned and respectful debates. It's not just that things like ad hominem arguments are against the rules in philosophy, But the very practice, the way that we frame our questions, frame them in general terms, itself encourages people to look beyond dislike of individuals or commitments to group allegiances when they think about the pros and cons of an argument. And again, this is something that people need to be able to do for all sorts of reasons. And you need to be able to take a challenge as a challenge to a view, and not a challenge to a view that you happen to hold, not a challenge to you as a person. And you need to be able to present your challenges to someone else as a challenge to their views and not as an attack on them as a person. And more than that, you need to be able to spot what assumptions other people are making to justify their views. And you need to be practiced at identifying argumentative structure if you want to challenge other people or argue with them. So I think philosophy's basic interest in argumentation and the structure of argumentation imparts this, and perhaps there's no better discipline for doing that. Of course, it's not just the skills that are used in philosophy that are relevant here. The topics that we talk about, as we're always keen to impress upon our participants, are all in one way or another part of everyday life. Talking about responsibility or obligation, these are things that they're going to face all the time. And we think, or we hope, that our participants gain a greater competence with concepts like power or responsibility, and we think that this is helpful in navigating the situations that they might find themselves in. Conceptual competence is useful in general, but I think that philosophy, or at least the branches of philosophy that we talk about, focuses on concepts that run really deep in everyday life, and whose comprehension is fundamental to navigating many of the most significant areas of potential disagreement that people face. So what's the end goal for our participants? Well, I think that the results of this kind of work are empowering in two basic kinds of ways. So the first is personal. Many of our participants coming in will repeat received opinion in quite surprising ways. And we've had people who are really upset and outraged by inequalities that they've faced and the people they know have faced and that they see as being entrenched and unfair. And we've had these people just affirming, as a matter of course, that everyone ought to have an inalienable right to what they've produced, or to what they own, or to what they've bought. Or people who have been absolutely outraged and demoralized and humiliated by racial discrimination, acceding to arguments for gender discrimination that could be and are applied in slightly altered forms to them, to justify their own exclusion. Or we've had people who get angry about the low standards of justification for banning marijuana, and this is a massive topic, because I'm sure, we don't know for a fact the reason that everyone has been caught involved, but a huge proportion of the offences are petty drug offences. And these people don't just think that it's unreasonable that many of them get sent to prison for this, but they also think that the arguments for the legal status of marijuana don't hold up, aren't sufficiently strong. And they'll say this at length, and yet these same people accept wild conspiracy theories without blinking. So philosophy, talking about ethical and epistemological and political questions, and doing that in a reasoned way, in a way that looks for the assumptions and the arguments and the justifications, is, I think, empowering in the sense that it invites people to develop considered views in the light of their own reflection and their own understanding, the views that they can live with. And I think that there's just no question that people are better off when they live their lives in accordance with values that they reflectively endorse. And it's most important for people who are in the worst position in society, who are most likely to have been indoctrinated with a set of presumptions whose main effect is to justify their own disadvantage. But also, philosophy is empowering because the ability to articulate and argue for what you think actually helps you do things. And this builds on what I was saying a minute ago. As I said, it helps you to justify yourself to others and persuade them. And even if you can't persuade them, to make a compelling case that others can't ignore. And this is especially important for our participants because for many reasons, these are people who have to face the brunt of great discrimination and are often swiftly and harshly judged And the more that they are able to justify themselves to others, the better, I hope, they will be equipped to fight back. And that's, I hope that's the truth. That's true. So, for example, stop and frisk was something that until very recently really hung over our participants' heads. They knew that they could be apprehended and humiliated at any time or in any place. And not just them, but the people they looked up to. And one told me about having his father, his elderly father, held up for 20 minutes outside his own home after just going out for some groceries. And just standing there outside his own home in front of his children and being interrogated and humiliated in front of them. And I think the humiliation wasn't just, was the participant, and this was something that really he felt deeply. And he knew this was wrong. They all knew that stop and frisk was wrong. And I hope that after our discussion, they were in a better position to explain exactly why they thought this was wrong and have in mind responses to potential countervailing arguments. Identifying the premises that were used to justify stop and frisk, and arguing by analogy to demonstrate the implications of those premises, and placing that in a framework of bigger issues to do with equality. I think that all these things make our participants better equipped to affect change. Likewise, the brutality of the prison system is something that's touched all of their lives. And again, at heart, this is a philosophical issue. For example, many of the people we've talked to argue against features of the prison system on the grounds that it has poor effects, that it doesn't prevent crime, or it's even counterproductive. The standard arguments for the counterproductivity of incarceration are offered, but also surprising ones. Like one pointed out to us that once people have been on the inside, they're not scared to go back. They expect to go back. And this was an argument for not locking up people for petty drug crimes. But they often come in subscribing to, or at least saying things that align with retributivist views. They would actually make these easily countered arguments. So helping them to work out what they think about the justification of punishment is also a way of helping them to develop arguments that might actually help bring about the reforms that they really want to see. But the views that our participants have aren't always the accepted ones, and after all, one might think, right, that there's the good arguments for the outcomes they want are already there. So why do they need to learn to develop arguments? What they should learn is just figure out who to vote for. You know, leaving aside the objection that working out that just is the question of working out how to develop your own arguments, I think this view misses something. Learning about philosophy might help some of our participants formulate views that run contrary to those that are often put forth in their names. Or maybe even views that are contrary to what I accept or what we accept. And it's always very important for us that we never try to push a particular view. We'll question and interrogate views, but always the goal is that the outcome should be a view that the participant reflectively endorses. So, I mean, look, if our only goal was to affect political change of some sort of predetermined sort, if we were just, individually, many of us have strong views about what we'd like to see in terms of prison reform, for example. And if that was all we were aiming for, then taking our participants to a political rally or getting them to join a political party might be a more immediate way to bring that about as a concrete reality. But I think that we need to be open-minded to the question that maybe the results that we think our participants need aren't really the ones that they need. And I think that we really need to give people the tools to genuinely make up their own minds and to argue what they think. Because otherwise I see the risk is that we'll close off certain avenues from being explored because we haven't asked the people that we care about what they actually value and what they actually want. So this brings me to the final section of my talk. So I promised I'd talk about some of the reasons why I think we, as philosophers, some of the reasons we have for getting involved in outreach work, reasons we have for wanting philosophy to be a public humanity. And although I've been couching this all in terms of the outreach that I've done, I think these reasons are things that apply more generally to any conception of how philosophy could work as something that reaches out from beyond the walls of academia. And I'm not going to get too technical here. I'm mainly going to talk about the area that I work on, which is ethics. And so one sort of reason, of course, for why we should do this as philosophers is that it benefits other people, which is what I've just said. But I think what I want to talk about now is what public philosophy can do for us. So there are four initial things. The first is that presenting philosophical arguments and questions to people outside of philosophy classrooms requires a huge amount of clarity of mind. You have to really know what the topics are and really be able to present those in simple and compelling ways. And I think this is a great philosophical virtue. And this is something that we take back to our work as philosophers. We've focused on ways of articulating in the clearest possible ways the things that we work on. And of course, we have to justify talking about these things to participants. So another thing that it focuses on is, why do these questions matter? What are the issues that really matter in talking about, say, philosophical questions to do with responsibility? And again, this is a huge philosophical virtue, and I think it offers, I think this is actually a very important methodology for dealing with entrenched philosophical questions. Because often, the way that a philosophical dialectic will go is, will be entrenched in a history of back and forth argument, and the risk I often feel is that the debate, because it's so focused on responding to what previous people in the literature may have said, can lose focus on what was really the motivating issue behind getting interested in that topic in the first place. And if we as philosophers are always being drawn back, always being called back to identifying and articulating what was the motivation for us doing this kind of work in the first place, I think that actually offers tools for overcoming forms of disagreement that might become entrenched, or lines of research that risk becoming moribund. Another thing is that we might, by getting new people involved, and not just in the sort of work I do, but in all forms of public philosophy, we might get new ideas onto the table. And again, another problem with philosophical entrenched problems or research programs that are going nowhere is often simply that the original ideas or sets of assumptions that people were working with just aren't enough, and that we need someone to come and do some new idea which will allow us to take philosophy further. And I think that the more people are being engaged in philosophical work and philosophical thinking, the better for that. And of course, finally, what we do as philosophers is come up with prescriptions, or things we think about how the world should be, or what people should endorse, or what sort of changes ultimately ought to be effected. But we couch these prescriptions in philosophical argumentation. And of course, the more people there are who are educated in and sophisticated in the forms of philosophical argumentation, the better chance we have of having our work heard. I think there are also some very specific reasons to do with ethics as well, that really vindicate the idea that philosophy just has to be a public and a publicly engaging enterprise. So, and there are some philosophers who think that the process of making ethical discoveries is something that can go on entirely in their own minds. They have special powers of intuition or reason that just enable them to grasp the ethical truth. And I think that if you have this view, there's no reason to think that widening access to philosophy would enrich the field, except on the off chance that it brought in someone who happened to be a genius. If public philosophy on this conception, or public ethics on this conception, could no more enrich the field than public maths would be expected to trigger a breakthrough. I think very little of this view. I think there is no realm of pre-existing moral facts, and there is no special power to discover them that philosophers have. I think there are far more plausible views. So one, which is the one I probably have least sympathy with, takes our initial moral judgments as starting points and attempts to work from there, either by viewing some as sufficiently secure to base all our judgments, or by working back and forth between the various starting views that we have to achieve a considered balance, or a reflective equilibrium, as the term of art is. Of course, the obvious objection to this is that this view is that it simply encodes whatever prejudices the philosopher or the philosophical tradition that she works in, or even the culture she represents, happen to have. So, as a result, there's now a group of experimental philosophers. And what they do is, rather than relying on their own initial judgments, they attempt to base philosophical work on what they call folk intuitions. And the way they gather this by performing surveys. But I think that the surveys that experimental philosophers have used are very crude. And I'm highly dubious that something as delicate as the structure of people's ethical viewpoints could be discovered by surveys. And I know this is hardly a fashionable thing to say, but my suspicion is that if such information were really valuable, then qualitative research would be the solution. Now, of course, we could just rely on anthropologists for this, but I think that anthropologists are not interested in just the same questions that would-be experimental philosophers should be interested in, and they're not interested in those questions in the same way. I think you find out distinctive things about the structure of people's evaluative perspectives by challenging them, and by pushing them, and by debating with them. So public philosophy, if we buy into this notion that we need to do experimental philosophy, then public philosophy in this sense would be the best way to get that kind of data. Another sort of justification would be based on the idea that, in one sense or other, yes, we can see ethical improvements when we encounter them, or at least we can given the right circumstances and the right education, but not in the sense that we can work out in advance what those are going to be. We need to actually be presented with situations. This is most relevant and challenging when it comes to the challenge of working out ways to live. We need people to actually engage in what we'll call experiments in living in order to give us cases to evaluate. And of course, the more people who are philosophically thoughtful, that are trying to work out new ways to live, try to experiment with new ways to live, the better for that, the better chances for discovery on that model. And the final position is my own. I don't think that there are any pre-existing moral facts that philosophers are setting out to discover, in the sense that they're there, whatever people think about them. I think that in some complex way, things are valuable ultimately because we value them. Ethics, which is the topic I work on, is ultimately something that we've created and that we're continuing to create. But the important part of my view, or my version of this view, is that this process of creation is something that we do together. The correct ethical systems, and I think there might be many different ways that we could go, are whichever ones we can all live with together. Of course, not anything that we happen to judge as good. These need to be carefully thought out judgments, developed in the light of our most considered concerns, converged upon as a result of reasoned and respectful persuasion. So for me, there really can't be ethical discovery without public philosophy. The more people we have deciding for themselves or together what's valuable, the closer we are to the legitimate creation of what William James called the ethical republic. I'm open to any...
So, I'll field questions.
Okay.
Okay, so Michelle, and then in the back, and then Leah. Oh, no, no. Okay. We'll
What
start.
you're doing is so valuable and so important, but you will, if you haven't already, encounter resistance from at least two groups. One's going to be the group inside the academy, and specifically in our discipline, who will see this as a threat to the continued existence of this kind of preserve of people who are trained and who are experts. And I think it's not just in philosophy that the resistance to this kind of public work is very important. And it will affect your ability to get more people other than fellow graduate students to sign on to its values. So I'll just throw that out. I want to know if you've thought about what that means. The second one is there's going to be resistance from some people outside the academy who will find it scary that your project is in fact empowering people who come from, socioeconomic environments where they're not used to being able to articulate what's important to them and push back. There are people, so this project Imagining America that Nancy Cantor runs out of Syracuse, if you go online and Google the responses, this is dangerous. Those pointy-headed left-wing intellectuals trying to stir up trouble. And so my second question is, have you thought about how to respond to the critics there, that you're stirring up trouble amongst people would otherwise be, malleable and manageable. So the two, the critics on the inside and the critics on the outside who are skewed.
Yes, so to the critics on the inside, this is a debate that needs to happen within philosophy, and it's a debate that, it's actually something that I work on. I think that this process of justifying philosophy to other people as something that we ought to do, explaining why philosophy is a worthwhile thing, and considering how people and who should be involved in philosophy. I think this is a really important philosophical question. And my hope is that my optimistic hope is that this is a conversation that we can have in an unprejudiced manner within philosophy and take it seriously as a philosophical question. And I know that there are people who don't think this is a worthwhile thing to do, or who think this is a waste of time, or who think that I'm just wrong in thinking that philosophy is something that belongs outside of the seminar room and 716 philosophy. I hope that they can at least listen to the reasons that I have. Now, as to those people outside who are hostile to what we're doing, and there are a few things we can do. One is that we're very, very careful not to present this as a form of political activism. So, although in conversation, we are all interested in justice, in inequality, and prison reform, and all sorts of political, live political issues, the way that we couch what we're actually doing and what we're actually presenting is that we don't tell people what to think. We talk about issues. These are philosophical issues. These are ethical issues that people should be concerned in. And I think if we were to face someone who had a very dim view of the idea of who we're working with, the way of saying, we're teaching people ethics, I think they would interpret that in a very different way.
You could say citizenship.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I think there's a challenge of learning how to present the same program in different ways.
Okay, so I've got here and then there. Okay, you're on.
First of all, thanks for very, very inspiring talks. One of the more inspiring I heard in a long time. So it was great. Just a quick question. I didn't get how the recruiting to these programs work. Are the kids or young male there in any sense voluntary, either in the program or in the philosophy workshop specifically? And how does this affect your work? Do you have any problems? I suppose people are not there really out of their own free will. And does this affect the discussions you have and how you approach it?
Yeah, so first there's a question of enrollment with our community partners, and then there's a question of attendance of our workshops. So, as I said, we have some difficulty in finding out exactly the reasons people are there, but the people are enrolled as justice scholars on a voluntary basis, for the most part. This is a program that's out there that's helping people who are transitioning, and they get paid to turn up. These are things that they want to get to achieve these various educational goals or personal goals in terms of advancement, but they're also paid a stipend for their time so that they can actually afford to be there. It's not a lot, but it certainly helps them. One person did once mention that staying on the program was a condition of his probation, but he wasn't forced to enroll in it. It was that he had to do something. I understand it, and again, I didn't want to push him. He had to be doing something to prove that he wasn't, with his time, prove that he wasn't doing whatever he'd been doing before, or they thought he'd been doing before. And in terms of going to Rethink discussions, that actually is different between our two different centres. At Harlem Justice, the participants, in order to remain on the programme and continue receiving their stipends, just have to do a certain number of hours a week, and there's quite a big diversity of programming, so people get an option as to whether Rethink is one of them or not. At the Fortune Society, it's slightly different in that there's not an official option, but nevertheless, they only have to do some percentage of the things that are offered in order to continue being signed on and getting paid. So it's essentially voluntary on both levels.
Okay, in fact.
Thank you. This sounds like an absolutely fantastic program. I have a comment that you can respond to maybe on the value of this for the participants, which I don't think you touched on, that is beyond cognitive competencies and conceptual tools. I think this kind of work gives a sense of confidence and identity that is disconnected, not disconnected, but that is not contingent on the philosophical content or the cognitive tools, right? I mean, so that's my first question. Would you agree with that?
And is this something that you might think of as being continuous with the idea of living by values that you reflectively endorse?
Living by values?
That you reflectively endorse.
Okay. I guess my question, and maybe I'm totally wrong actually, but was more about creating not just how it will change their cognitive practices or values or how they live, but a sense of confidence or of being part of an intellectual community that maybe they felt that they didn't have before. Or
yes. I mean, I think just the mere fact of having people listening to your evaluative perspectives, I think that really is changing for some of them. I think some of them have never had an opportunity to have their voices heard in that way, and I think that makes them feel, if only temporarily and if only in a small way, included or heard in a way that is new. And again, it's not a huge effect, and none of this is. It's not a huge effect. That would be very ambitious, but I do think that there are people who turn up to our sessions who really appreciate this, and they feel very differently about themselves and what they have to offer and what kind of status and respect they can have.
My next comment, I guess, was on the distinction between doing work in prison and with or involve people outside of prison, which I'm sure you didn't mean to present it as an either or.
No.
But I wanted to point out that there are spaces inside prisons where there are not guards present,
yes,
etc. And also that the populations don't, while there is a lot of overlap, they're not identical populations, right? And one of the arguments that is sometimes given against, by people on the side of people should do this kind of work in general, but against working with certain populations in prison is if people are serving long sentences or are serving life sentences. If the point is on giving people tools to reduce recidivism, etc., then there's no point, right? And that, I think, is a danger that we need to be aware of.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to bash doing work in prisons. Primarily, it's a practical thing. That if you want to get a bunch of very busy graduate PhD students from Columbia doing this every week, and it's preparing these sessions and the emotional toll that it takes, I just thought it would be better if this was going to be a long-term project if it didn't also involve a huge and entirely extraneous practical side of getting. And we actually had to get volunteer clearance to work at Harlem Justice initially, and that alone was a nightmare. I mean, getting tests, getting background checks, and having medical tests to see if we were, to test that we weren't taking drugs and all sorts of things like that. And that was, for a very low level. I mean, to go into prisons is a lot more of an effort. Yes, I know that there are opportunities to work in spaces where you don't have guards, but again, that's a question of negotiation, which can be very contested. And we felt that if we could do all these things without going through that, all the better. And in terms of this question of, well, these people who might not get back, why bother teaching or working with people who are there for life? Well, I think that's an argument that people can make. I don't want to make that the sole justification of doing what I'm doing.
No, I wasn't.
And if people make that argument and that helps them to endorse or support what I'm doing, fine.
So I just want to intervene for a second here. One is that you mentioned it was Columbia students, but you're also branching out to NYU, right?
Yes, this is actually something that's now happening. It's not happened yet because we need a new centre for them to work at, because we already have as many volunteers as we need. So for the future, NYU used to have a philosophy outreach that was rather like ours, working in schools, but all the contacts of schools have gone, and the people who ran it are now leaving. And so the graduate student who's the head of NYU's outreach has basically asked if they can join us, which is very exciting. So we're going to have a new pool of volunteers where many of the NYU grad students live in Harlem anyway, so we're going to try and have another centre in Harlem, and hopefully down the line we'll be able to establish one in Brooklyn, where many of them live. I know there's also been some interest from some people at the New School, maybe.
Hopefully, yeah.
And another thing, of course, is that there's talk of establishing a Justice Scholars Program here in Columbia.
Right, which I'll talk about in a second. I'll say now. There's a movement at this point. It's called the Justice Initiative, and if you Google ji.columbia.edu, you'll find out about it. It started out initially as a criminal justice initiative at the social work school, but it's now broadened to encompass lots of people at Columbia. And actually, the Heyman Center is offering. Max turned to Christina because she's sort of working on it. We're working to establish a Clementi type program, which gives free education through the School of Continuing Education to the kind of population that Max is talking about. And also we're working on course development. And I think I've got a course that's be team taught by somebody in social work and somebody on this campus. There'll be a couple of, one thing might happen is that there'll be people talking about women, to inform students on campus, right? I mean, the real courses about, like, let's say, women's health in prisons on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's somebody, they're now working on a project where you would have graduate students here being in a reading group with people in prisons, right? So it's a classroom together. So, and there's lots of things going on, I guess, besides Max's model, but which has been really, part of the big puzzle. But anyway, I want to get back. So Ian's next.
Yeah. My question is actually just really, really like small scale. I want to know a little more about sort of how the instructors or the facilitators, I guess you'd rather be called, sort of structure the discussions and the sessions. My guess is it's sort of like your vision for kind of a discussion that's kind of on the rails, and a discussion that's gone off the rails is very different from your conception of an on-the-rails discussion, say, in like a college classroom. Yeah. But there must be some overlap and something like valuable to take away from that. So what is, how do you, like, what is on the rails? How do you keep it on the rails? Various things of that sort.
It's on the rails as long as they're talking about the topic. I mean, often these will break down into sort of like sidebar conversations, or people even get up to speak. We had one participant who was very enthusiastic, but every time he really cared about it, he would stand up, and he had quite an imposing presence. And essentially people get up and walk across the room to talk to someone they disagree with, but we can't let side conversations, this sort of thing, go on for too long, but we're also very careful to make sure we don't shut that down straight away in the way that you might if it was an undergrad classroom, because this might be the point at which someone starts moving, starts running with an idea. So yes, there are different rules. In terms of how each session is structured, they're different, and it's important that we have different things each session, because otherwise people will think it's just sort of the same old, same thing every time, and the worry is that the topics are going to become blurred. So we do try and have like different structures and different approaches week on week.
I just wanted to add, like, one of the things that we talk about when we train facilitators at the New York Council of Humanities, who are often educators in their real lives, is this idea that a side conversation, for instance, is actually a sign that you're probably talking about something that's really interesting and people are really into it. And then you have to kind of retrain your brain to think about, you know, that's evidence of something's working, even if it's not, you know, and especially for people who feel uncomfortable sharing out with a huge group, this is the way that they will participate in the conversation. And your job is not to shut that down, but to just make those people feel more comfortable to share outside. So it's, I mean, it's very interesting, I think, and you can talk about this, but, or probably have experiences this, how public conversations with general public audiences are may look on the surface like a classroom, but are actually often very different dynamics are taking place, and you have a very different role as a facilitator in that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
and it's also it's a very difficult balancing act as a facilitator because there are times when you do need to redirect things, or you do really, or someone saying something offensive or aggressive, and you really do need to shut it down, or someone's just disrespecting another person. And there's a very difficult balancing act between asserting the level of authority that's needed to avoid problems, and yet not being seen as an authority figure. And one of the advantages sometimes we normally have someone else in the room, a social worker or an instructor, and at times we've been very lucky in who we've been working with, because we had one social worker who worked in our inaugural term, who was great at this. He would get involved in only the very positive ways, and he freed us from that burden. But at other times, it's been much more of a balancing act for us of what role we want to play. So yeah, that's a difficulty.
Is this a follow-up?
Yes, okay, go ahead. In 1990, I was actually at the new school doing the East Studies program, and I was invited to speak to Paulo Freire, who had been brought to New York City for his 70th birthday. And I presented a paper on the condition of silence and what I called the mess in the idea of the consciousness-raising group. And so it speaks to actually what was just said, this idea that I have been both belligerent and dismissed for, which is precisely that the rails, as they were previously referred to, are in and of themselves a socio-historic trajectory that is never innocent, far from innocent. And so I find this work extraordinary because it's precisely, much of the work I've done is actually in activism, a lot of it having to do with women, but not only women, and certainly women from very different demographics and perspectives. And this idea that we give the idea of right and grounding and reason to certain kinds of argumentation, and that becomes a way of disavowing the existence of certain peoples who cannot fully articulate their position or present counter-positions. I think this work is just extraordinary, and precisely because of this work, this is what needs to come back into philosophy as a discipline. And if I could just give one idea of that, it would be 1972 Berkeley Anthropology, where they decided to study up. As opposed to studying the proverbial down and out in other people's places, the ideas were to use the tools of anthropology and certainly philosophy to say, what are the systems that create this? Like, why are we going to an island when we are creating islands in our urban centers? And then what are the systemic choices that are being made that actually configure those circumstances and make people a limited population that are not engaged or participating or self-defining and ultimately not allowed to contribute in any way? And the cost to society as a whole, but certainly the lives lost in that process. So thank you very much for this presentation, but if you could speak just for a minute about that, more to that idea of how the philosophical self-conception needs to change, or can change through this kind of work.
Well, so one thing that I've been challenged on is that I've been told that this work is assimilationist, or it's somehow arrogant, the idea that we should be going out and making people do philosophy the way that we do philosophy. And this is something I think about. And my response is that I do think that the very core of what we're doing, and what I think that people who working in philosophy and people working in value philosophy is something that is something that is so everyone can take advantage of. I'm not trying to push one particular moral outlook or political outlook, or even just one particular set of methods for doing that kind of thinking. But there are certainly ways of talking and thinking that we present and we showcase and we encourage people to engage in, but we see these as being sufficiently general that the purpose is to empower and to help people rather than to impose. So I think that's sort of the, and as you said about this question about the rails, and I think that actually Ian would totally agree, is the norms for a discussion have to be based on the context that discussion is in and the aims of that discussion. So, and of course, we all teach at Columbia as well as doing our facilitation work in Harlem, and a sensitivity to context and our aims there is going to inform what sort of things we need to, what sort of norms we need to encourage people to respect. And one thing you said, one thing that we could have an interesting conversation about afterwards is issues to do with women and gender, because we have had female participants are very much in a minority, as the majority of people who are enrolled in this are male. We have had females in the room, and it's been interesting how that's affected the dynamic. It's been interesting how to talk about gender and to talk about gender issues with some of our participants have had very, very misogynistic views, and how to bring that, put that on the table and challenge them to think about gender in a way that doesn't just alienate them or tell them that they're wrong. Mm-hmm. I think that's a huge challenge. I think a challenge that many of us who fundamentally, it's a challenge to our own ethical views that we want to respect, listen to our participants, but we need to get them to respect and listen to each other, and to bring those things together is a big challenge.
Will?
So I think that this is a really fascinating project, and my question is sort of about, to use a kind of terrible term, the sort of scalability of it, and whether you've thought about kind of how this sort of project is something that could be extended to other places, and also from a slightly more problematic viewpoint, the degree to which this is a project that is only possible in very certain kinds of locations, right? That Central Harlem is an interesting place for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it's right next to a major research university with a lot of graduate students who can do this kind of project. And that's true of many urban areas, but not all of them, and not uniformly within them. And as you suggested, right, that this is easier to do in Harlem than it would be in many other parts of New York City. Right. And it's also might be something that's harder to do in rural areas than urban areas. So just about those questions of, if you really wanted to think about how to extend this model as far as possible, how you would deal with some of those geographic challenges.
It might be that you can't necessarily do this everywhere. I do think that this is replicable. I do think it's a replicable program. I think both just the very model of it, and also a lot of the actual materials we've developed and the session plans that we've developed are things that we explicitly thought part of what we were trying to do over the course of this year was to develop things that other people could use if they wanted to. But it was conceived as something, how can graduate students in philosophy and related disciplines do something for those that they're around? And I just think that in the end it might be that sadly there are some areas that are going to be underserved by this. And I don't really see any immediate solution to that. But nevertheless, I think the question shouldn't be, this should be everywhere, why isn't it everywhere? But this currently isn't anywhere, so where can we get it to be?
It could certainly be in Detroit, right? And it could be in Northern California. And
it could be in
St. Louis.
Yeah.
St. Louis, UCLA.
It can be in Chicago.
So I think you and then me.
Oh, I was just wondering, doing any kind of training the facilitators, and is there a sort of feedback loop to talk about what worked and what didn't work, or what works in those kind of situations?
So sadly, Leah's just left. So we actually had, I've had part of my fellowship and this is one of the really great things about the fellowship that's been offered in partnership with the Heyman Center and the New York Council, is that I had a whole day of training in facilitation with the other fellows down at the New York Council. And then we also took the other people who were volunteering from Columbia to do the same session. Now they have a model, and it's for more general application than just what we're doing, because many of the public audiences they're reaching are older, have a higher reading level, are perhaps motivated for different reasons to be attending public humanities programming. So we don't really feel that we need to provide them with feedback on what hasn't worked for us, because we're doing something different from their more general model. But we do provide each other with feedback. We're working, obviously, as you will realise, that there are now separate groups that are working independently. So Robbie and I don't actually work in the same group. Alex Regas, who was here earlier, is with Robbie's group, and Yoni Badez is in my group, and John Patuzzo, who is the person from Teach College, is at the other group. But then we'll meet and we'll give feedback about what worked, what didn't work. We'll share plans that we developed we'll normally modify them after the session and say, well, this is how it worked, and this is what you should change, and why don't you try doing it that way? And then after the other group has run it, then we'll make further revisions, and we'll think, well, next time we do it, we'll do it this way. So yeah, there's a constant development and a constant experimentation in ways that we can do this.
So one question with the instrumental value of the program to participants.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you are following them in any way, or whether you have any way to follow them. In your comments, you talked about you say you don't want to put all the weight on that, but you do write some checks in terms of what you think this program can do for the people that are participating in it. And so it might be as simple as a recidivism rate or something like that. I mean, these are populations that there's lots of really, really rich data on their behavior. And so if there's any way to track them, it might be a very interesting touch point.
Well, of course, in the groups, the organizations that we work with are collecting some data, but that's not sufficiently fine-grained to tell what effects our program's having, except in a purely speculative way. Actually, it is a bit of a challenge to gather data, because sometimes participants will just drop off the map. Participants will just drop off the map sometimes and maybe reappear. And sometimes it's actually hard to know where they've gone. But one of the plans that we have for the next year, which I've discussed with some people from the New York Council, is we're currently applying, or in the process of applying for various sources of funding. First, to fund some of the materials we need, to offer stipends to the facilitators who have so far been volunteering a huge amount of their time and emotional resources, and we haven't had any remuneration or even costs for traveling to. Some people are traveling from further away. One of them is actually traveling from Philadelphia, having recently moved there. But one of the things that we want to do with grant money, if and when we get it, is to hire a professional evaluator to develop a specifically tailored evaluative model with relevant metrics, which we can then use to see exactly, or in more detail, what we've achieved in instrumental terms.
So just a brief follow-up. How long are there like, so like a 6-week or a 6-month? Is there a defined period of time of the program, and if so, how often do participants show up? I mean, you say that they're paid. Are they going to lose their payment if they never come?
So it's normally around 10-week courses once a week. They're normally there at the partner organizations for longer than 10 weeks, but of course, due to the nature of the academic year, there are certain times when we can't do the work. So over the summer break, there just aren't enough of us around to have consistency. And one of the really important things one of the foundational things that we said at the beginning was that we needed to show up. Everyone who is a facilitator needs to show up regularly. And maybe once you're away because you're sick or you have another commitment, but it needs to be a consistent group of people that they're working with. And we've actually had times when we've said, oh, well, we can't do next week because that's our spring break. And if you're not coming, you're not going to be there. And so it's been really important for us that we show up. For them, they have the option. And it would to not get their stipends would involve something much bigger than them not turning up to our sessions. But there are some people, and also a lot of people have issues going on in their lives that are entirely not relevant to whether they're motivated to turn up to anything offered by the programs. But there are some people who get really enthused and who will be there every week, and there are some people who won't be there every week, but when they come, they're very into it. And there are some people who show up once and they're not very interested. So it's a variety, and we're not interested in forcing anyone to do this if they're not motivated to do it. But
Yeah. Really quick follow-up. I don't know if you've talked to anybody from the Cornell prison education program. It's a different population, obviously, going back to the question of prisons. But they have a structure of funding that's very interesting. So they get a little bit of state money from the land grant office at Cornell. But, because Cornell's
there's a land grant university. Yeah.
But they've got a seed grant from something called the Sunshine Lady Foundation. It's Warren Buffett's sister inherited some stock from Berkshire Hathaway, about as valuable as you'll get stock anywhere in the world. And she wants to give all her money away. And some of the programs she supports are these kind of unusual learning initiatives. And she's given money to the Cornell prison program. And then they also have donors. They just, as part of that, now this is always challenging because then you've got to work through development at your institution. But they also have a program that lets people donate from anywhere in the public sphere to support these programs. So you could put together a mix of funding, including seeking it from granting agencies that are more conventional. I would even not ignore the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Learning. They're big on scholarship of engagement. So I think we talked a little bit about this. But the Sunshine Lady, I think she wants to give her money away. She says all of it. So
that sounds
her name is I think it's Doris Buffett. It's Warren Buffett's sister.
Well, that sounds fantastic. People who want to give their money away,
yeah,
I want to know them.
Especially if they're called the Sunshine Lady.
Just a quick follow-up comment to the question about scalability. So I know Max mentioned about the ability to reuse the curriculum in different areas, different environments. And we currently have a partnership with the New York City Department of Education is opening up a few new schools that are highly innovative, reworking from the ground up everything from location, curriculum, staffing. And we're currently repurposing the curriculum that we've been using in our Rethink sessions to their metrics for their use. Well, it's not going to be the same model because there's a whole different range of dynamics as well as metrics they're going to have to change for the classroom environment. It is taking the same kind of material.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll see something, a relative of our course implemented in these new schools that are being founded.
Okay, maybe time for one more question. Rebecca? No?
Well, no, I'm curious. Actually, I guess this is maybe a different version of Will's question, but I mean, this is fantastic. It's really inspiring. But I'm a historian, not a philosopher. So, what about me? Can you think of ways that other people in other humanities might adopt some of what you're doing as a philosopher with this outreach program?
So I think this is a very interesting question. And I'll start by saying that history already has a big place in the public humanities in a way that philosophy didn't.
Except that it seems to be quite thin compared to what you're suggesting is like really incredible grassroots kind of empowerment of people, as opposed to learn about your local green space, what it used to be.
There are things that I think serve some of the same goals, so not all of the same goals. Things that involve local communities and maybe sort of underrepresented and underacknowledged immigrant communities in developing spaces that serve as commemorations and living reminders of their own cultural heritage and of making this physically present in the urban environment. So I think that there are things that, and of course, one of the important sort of rules for doing public humanities is to involve the relevant people in developing any sorts of materials. So if you're going to do an exhibit or set up a museum or set up a cultural space, it can't just be something that someone who happens to have an interest in, I'm very interested in the history of Puerto Ricans in East Harlem. No, it has to involve all the relevant stakeholders in that. So this is always something that happens. In terms of this very specific kind of conversation that we're having at Rethink, I think that I don't know enough about, that's something that historians, if you can think of a way to repurpose this, that would be wonderful.
So, Rebecca, we really are working on developing this thing with the continuing ed to offer free classes. So it's pretty much like, so this would carry Columbia College credit. Cool. And at least one of the courses is modeled on CC. Right? So it's a kind of a smaller, but intellectually rigorous, but it's great.
So
I'll sign you up.
So there's a bunch of issues. So one of the things is that one hope that we have is that if this gets set up at Columbia, then we can use our community partnerships as a pipeline. Right. So people who've been at the community partnerships and who've been interested and motivated, we might direct them to come and then start doing things for credit at Columbia. Another thing is that one problem with the Clementi course, which some of you might know about, which offers college level credit in the humanities for free, is that they have a very high dropout rate. Because you're taking people who haven't been in education, throwing them straight into a 3-credit course with readings and writing assignments, and that can be a challenge. So one of the things that Christina and I talked about is, how can we use something like this, something like a reading group, something like a very, very introductory writing course, to have maybe 3, some smaller, maybe 1-credit courses that people take before they move on to something which is a full core style college course, to help people ease into the academic environment. So the idea is that they'll learn about discussion and debate doing something like Rethink, and they'll learn more about writing in a different course. And so the question then is, where do you see history? Do you see that in philosophy, I think, is well placed to be early on in that pipeline? Maybe history is something that you'll want to introduce later on in that pipeline, but I'm not sure.
That's great.
Okay, so help me thank you.